Welcome back to the Canadian Politics Update. This is for June 2025. We've got a lot to talk about in this video. Parliament returned. There's some stuff that's happening in the political world that will matter a bit to a lot in the near future. And we also have a lot of firearm news to talk about, which is a bit of a surprise considering nothing actually concrete happened, but there are things that are being set up for more to happen in the future. So let's get into Parliament returning. As you can see, Parliament returned on May 26th, and it just finished on Friday, June 20th. They will not return until September 15th. In the meantime, most of the MPs will be taking a break from their very hard work this year, as you can see by the calendar, and they will visit their constituencies and all that. Now, what happened in the Parliament? Well, that is actually a very interesting thing that happened. The minority status of the Liberal government is playing out in a way that I didn't quite expect. I didn't think the NDP would dare to vote anything down at this point because they don't have a leader. And I thought, when they get the leader, they would start to vote things down. But that's not really the case. The NDP seems like they're really trying to shake off Jagmeet Singh's incompetence and try to position themselves as left-wing opposition, not a left-wing partner. It started with this tweet on June 4th, shortly after Parliament resumed, saying that the NDP will vote against the throne speech. And if the NDP is voting against the throne speech, that means the Conservatives and the Bloc would have to vote for the throne speech in order for it to pass. So later in the day, we got this. The throne speech was adopted, but without a vote. So essentially what happened is the NDP, the Bloc, the Greens, and the Conservatives would have voted down the throne speech, but none of them wanted an election. And if they had voted down the throne speech, it would have resulted in an election. So what they did instead was they passed it on division, which means there was no recorded vote held. And it's a way for the parties in the House of Commons to essentially say, we don't agree with you, but we're giving you a pass for now. And that pass is almost certainly going to last until at least the NDP gets a new leader and a year has passed for the Bloc. As we talked about before, the Bloc said they will support this government for a year on most things. And the NDP, well, I'm a bit surprised the way that they're acting, but I don't think they're going to actually pull down the government for at least a year or until they get a leader. So that leaves us with the big bill that was brought in for this House of Commons session, and that is Bill C-5. Bill C-5 was incredibly controversial. There is so much about it to talk about, and I just don't have the time in this video. You could make an entire video on Bill C-5 alone. I would recommend looking up a few videos on YouTube, looking up a few articles, trying to get a sense of the bill if you're very interested in it. But there's one very, very, very key point in it, and that is it would, in a way, speed up a lot of projects. This is very controversial for a lot of the Native communities because they feel like they're just going to be ran over. They're going to be consulted, apparently, but not actually listened to, is kind of the vibe that we were getting from this bill. Now, the Conservatives voted in favor of this, and it makes sense. This is something the Conservatives would have done, and if it was the Conservatives doing it, you know the Liberals would have been raising hell about it. So it's just a bit odd to see this bill pass the way it was. But the Liberals didn't need that much more support behind it, right? They only need, four votes for things to pass? I think it's maybe actually only 3. Whatever it is, they don't need a lot of votes, and the Conservatives voted in favor of it. There were some other ones, like there were internal trade barrier provisions, and that passed unanimously, except for Elizabeth May, because she's probably drunk somewhere. But overall, it was a controversial bill, and it passed the House of Commons. Now, it still needs to pass the Senate. The Senate will wrap up by June 27th. If the Senate can pass their examination of the bill with no amendments to the bill, then it will be given royal assent. However, if the Senate decides that they want to amend the bill in some ways and they need to send it back to the House of Commons, they will need to wait until the House returns on September 15th. Either way, this bill is almost certainly going to get passed by the end of the fall session, which is very unusual for a bill. Most of the time, these kinds of bills spend months and months and months in committee study. That is not the case here. This bill was written, introduced, went through all of the House of Commons procedures, and passed in less than 3 weeks. Now, this has been done before. We saw it with Bill C-21, actually, with the gun ban bill last Parliament. The difference was they didn't actually start accelerating it until very late in the process. And the other difference is that they did face opposition from all of the parties on various different things, and none of the other parties want to speedrun it until the very end. As we can see, it is very possible for bills to be rushed through. And if you're thinking, what effect does this have on gun control? We will talk about that next with the committees. This is the SECU committee, which is the committee that takes all of the gun control public safety bills and does the reviews of them. What is very interesting here is there will be, one of these liberals will be a chair, so that means that they won't be voting unless it's a tied or a deadlocked committee. That means that the MP that has essentially the deciding vote on every single matter will be the Bloc Québécois. That is not ideal for gun control. We did see in the SECU committees for the Bloc in C-21, they put up somewhat of a questioning, like they didn't want to rush through it, but it's still the Bloc Québécois and they're still very anti-gun. So if there is a gun ban bill or there's a gun control bill of some kind, I would not expect it to sit in SECU very long. In previous videos, I've said that the average for a gun control bill to pass and receive royal assent is somewhere around 18 months plus or minus 2. I think it's very likely at this point with this SECU committee that we could drop that by 4 or 5 months. I think we could see a gun control bill go through all of its stages and get royal assent within 12 months. But that is it for the gun control portion for now, because we have a lot more to talk about in terms of the actual gun control things in Canada happening later in the video. Now, another thing that happened in Parliament was the absolute decimation of the new public safety minister. He failed spectacularly. Gary was horrible. The public safety minister didn't know what an RPAL or the Canadian Firearms Safety Course is, which is just unbelievable. He also didn't know what the classifications of firearms were. He had no idea. He had to be given a note, like in school, to know what these classifications were, which is just shambolic. He used the excuse that he's new in the job, but come on, man. This would take you like an hour of your day that you've had weeks to prepare for, and you just didn't know. Like, I understand if he didn't know the intricacies of, let's say, magazine law, where pistol mags and in rifles and things like that. Like, I could understand that. But to not even know what an RPAL is, or the classifications of firearms, that's unacceptable. And the news didn't stop coming for Gary. He has officially recused himself from 2 files related to terrorist groups, specifically the Tamil movement in Sri Lanka. Now, I am not an expert on Sri Lankan politics. I don't know exactly how this works. I've seen a comparison that this is kind of like the FLQ of Sri Lanka, but I'm not going to comment further on like the internal politics of it. But I do know that a lot of these groups are viewed as terrorist entities in Canada. And the fact that he had to excuse himself from these matters because he has ties that are too close to the terrorist entities is, well, concerning, to say the least. We'll see what this has. This obviously is just a preemptive move, so we have no idea how this is going to affect anything in the near future, but I suspect this will come back up again at some point, so long as he's safety minister for more than a few more weeks. Now, another big story from this month was international news. Now, I'm not going to get into Israel and Iran and all of that entails, because that is way too deep for this kind of video. I'm strictly speaking about Canadian things. But there is one very strong military-related thing that happened this month, and that is that Carney said Canada will meet the 2% NATO spending target by March. And I must remind you that this means we will be spending an extra $40 or so billion by March of 2026, so less than a year. Now, how can this be done? Well, he says $9.3 billion of that will be new spending for military recruitment, pay increases for personnel. Okay, so you're a quarter of the way there, roughly. Now, you can add a few other spending areas, which I think I saw amounted to roughly $3 or $4 billion if you start including things that aren't traditionally included in military spending in this country. But again, you're still short by like 25-ish million dollars. And how will they get there? Well, debt spending. There's really no other way. The only way we get there is if Carney adds another $25 billion to the debt. And we will not be getting a budget. Well, we didn't in this past parliamentary session. They said there wasn't even going to be one this year at all until pressure caved and they said, all right, we're going to do a budget in the fall. So we'll see what kind of military spending they're going to do there. But that is a lot of money. A lot of money. Now, is this needed? Almost certainly. Canada, if they want to be taken seriously as an independent nation, really needs to up their game on military spending and military strength. There was an article sometime last year that stated that the Canadian military only has 3 or 4 days worth of ammo stockpiled if they were to enter into a war. Let that sink in. Canada could fight a war for a total of 3 to 4 days using our current stockpiles. I know that we would be ramping up ammo production, but I guarantee you it's going to take more than 3 to 4 days. So if Canada were to enter a major war, we would be screwed. So yeah, there's a lot of work that needs to be done on the Canadian military side. We'll see if any of it actually ends up happening or if it's just going to be throwing money into the wind to say that we met the 2% spending target. But who knows? We'll come back to this topic around the time when the budget is presented, and we'll discuss it further then when we have some more concrete news. Now, an update to Pierre Poilievre getting his seat. Damien Kurek has finally stepped down from his seat in Battle River Crowfoot. That means that the process can now begin. It is expected that Pierre will get his by-election going sometime in August, maybe early September. He should be able to sit in Parliament after winning that riding, which is basically guaranteed, sometime in September. If it's not in the beginning on September 15th when Parliament returns, I'd fully expect it to happen sometime around the end of September. I don't think we're going to go into October with no Pierre in the House. But speaking of Pierre, he will face a leadership review when Conservative Party members meet in Calgary in January. Now, I want to get this very clear. This is not a random call from the Conservatives to oust Pierre. What this is a required vote after a loss by the Conservative Party of Canada. Every time they lose an election, they must run a leadership review, which, in my opinion, is a very smart thing to do. But that does raise some questions. Will Pierre keep his seat? I am 80% confident that Pierre will win the vote. However, winning it with, say, 51% is not enough. If he wants to keep his role as leader of the Conservative Party, he's going to have to get at least 60 to 65% of the vote, which is right around where he got when he was first elected back in 2022. I do think he's going to be able to get that simply because he expanded the Conservative Party base by such a huge amount. He will have a lot of support behind him, and I don't think there's anyone, or I haven't seen anyone so far, seriously come out of the woodwork to try and pressure Pierre. But I guarantee you there will be someone who comes out and is saying, vote no on Pierre so we can have a leadership election and let me run. Will that person be successful? I don't think so, but I do expect it to happen. So this is another piece of news that will have an impact sometime in the next 12 months. Now, I won't normally cover provincial politics, but this is actually very important for federal politics. Pablo Rodriguez, if you don't remember him from the Trudeau Liberals, has become the Quebec Liberal Party leader, and I believe they were leaderless for a really long time. Now, why does this matter? That matters because the polling numbers change. The PQ, who are the separatist provincial party, they're like the Bloc, but for the provincial legislature, were running in majority territory, and strong majority territory. They were looking to easily sweep Quebec and win a majority, which, very importantly, would mean they would be putting another Quebec referendum vote on the table. However, there was hypothetical polling before Rodriguez was made party leader of the Liberals in Quebec, and that showed him neck and neck with the PQ. Now, with him being officially leader, the first poll from Palestera shows that he is right behind the PQ. Now, the Liberals are not going to win a government. The Liberals are actually super inefficient in Quebec, provincially speaking, but they are going to probably prevent a PQ majority. With these numbers, it would be on thin ice. And if it's a PQ minority, then that means that the threat to the federal government of Quebec separation and all of the stuff that goes along with it would not happen, which means Carney would have a much easier time keeping his Quebec caucus, which there is a lot of them, in check. The election in Quebec isn't scheduled until 2026, but I suspect we will be seeing a lot of noise out of Quebec over the next few months. So this is a story to keep an eye on, and I will update you if anything big happens. That is it for all of the regular news, but now we move over to the firearm news. So, on to the firearms part of the video. This specific section that I'm about to talk about might be a bit long, and it might stretch out this video an extra 5-10 minutes. But there are of course timestamps if you're not interested in this. So, let's get right into this specific topic, which is Alberta trying to circumvent the criminal code and introduce an Alberta Firearms Act. What would that look like? Well, I'm going to play you a short clip of Danielle Smith, the Premier of Alberta, speaking at an event about exactly this. Now, I will link to this tweet where you can watch the full 3 minutes, but I just want to play the short 1-minute clip talking about this specific part of it.
The last thing that I'm exploring, and I've asked Scott Moe, we had a joint caucus meeting with Saskatchewan because they feel very much the same way. Is there a way for us to create our own Alberta firearms license that would allow for us to say any guns purchased legally as of, I don't know, January 1st, 2000, you can own, keep, and use in the province of Alberta? That's what we're going to try to do. Because here's the thing, I mean, the federal government can regulate certain types of property. They can regulate the criminal use, and we've seen this. There's vehicular homicide, there's drunk driving. If you're using your vehicle in a way that is committing a crime, that falls into federal jurisdiction. But they don't control our registry for how we do automobile registrations. That is provincial jurisdiction because it's a property issue. So it's very much the same thing. Fine, federal government control the criminal use of firearms, but the legal use of firearms, the legal ownership of firearms, we believe that's property and civil rights. Section 13 of the Constitution, our purview, and we are going to fight it to the nth degree because we just do not think that this is a proper policing priority.
So what Danielle Smith said there is very, very intriguing. In fact, it's so intriguing that I almost made this its own video, but I feel like it's better as part of this video considering I'm not a constitutional lawyer and I'm just guessing. But I am going to give my opinion on this, and I'm going to go over some of the challenges I expect it to face and if I think it's going to be successful. First, we have to go and look at what Danielle Smith is talking about. She is talking about the Constitution Act of 1867 and 1982. She is talking about Section 92(13). Section 92 states, "In each province, the legislature may exclusively make laws in relation to matters coming within the classes of subjects next hereinafter enumerated, that is to say, Section 13, property and civil rights in the province." Now, Danielle Smith gave a few examples, and her examples were not ideal in my opinion. Now, if you follow me on Twitter, you would have already seen my thoughts on this, but I'm going to kind of expand more on it, and it'll probably come across better on audio. The major problem that Danielle Smith has in her plan is that the federal government determines what is or is not criminal activity. Now, she gave the example of vehicles. If someone uses a vehicle to commit a crime, it falls under federal jurisdiction, which is the criminal code. However, vehicles in the province and in every province are regulated through provincial means, provincial driver's licenses, provincial registrations, and very importantly, how cars are driven, right? The traffic laws of the road are different from province to province. Many of them are the same, but there are some different ones. Danielle Smith is suggesting that this is equivalent to the usage of firearms, that people using firearms that were banned before but were legally owned and operated, the province has the right to determine how those items are legally used. Now, she could be 100% right on this, but I think she's going to run into some problems. Because her example is not one-to-one. So we're going to convert her example to firearms. She's talking about vehicle usages, which would be like the traffic laws and things like that. Well, the equivalent to that in the firearms world would be how and where people can carry firearms in the wilderness or not, how ranges are built and whether or not they meet the standards set out by the provincial firearms officer, and how gun stores and zoning laws work with regards to all of that. That is all provincial jurisdiction. That is how firearms are used. Now, the difference is that the province sets who can acquire a vehicle. Now, the same thing can be done with firearms. Theoretically, Danielle Smith could, if she wanted to, create the Alberta Firearms Act, the Alberta Firearms License, which is a separate thing from the federal firearms license, and Alberta would determine how firearms are acquired. The problem that she runs into is what they determine is a legal firearm cannot go against what the federal government determines an illegal firearm is, because the federal government has jurisdiction over what is a criminal activity. So, for example, the big thing right now is the sale of gas-powered cars in 2035. The federal government seems like they're going to still keep on with this, and this has more in common with firearms than most people would think at first. Think of it this way. The federal government is banning the sale of new gas-powered vehicles in 2035. That's the plan. Well, all of the people that have gas-powered vehicles are still going to be driving around in them, and you can still buy used gas-powered vehicles on the secondary market. So if we were using this in firearms terms, what would we call this? Well, we'd call it grandfathering. They're essentially grandfathering gas-powered vehicles. The difference with this grandfathering is that people who own them can still use them and sell them. That is not the case with banned firearms, at least most of them up until recently. The 12.6 pistols were kind of like that. So going back to Danielle Smith's proposal, she is asking a very different question that I think a lot of people are anticipating. She's proposing this as people who owned these firearms before they were banned should still be able to use them legally because they were legal property, which falls into provincial jurisdiction. But I don't think that's going to be the question that comes up to the Supreme Court of Canada, which, if this is done, will absolutely move to the Supreme Court of Canada. The actual question that they will be asking is this, and I'm just going to read what I wrote down. Can Alberta, through its own firearms licensing system, allow the use of items that are considered illegal by the federal government through the use of Section 9213, the Property Rights Clause, of the Constitution? Using the vehicle example, if the federal government made it a crime to own and use gas-powered vehicles with two doors, does Section 9213 allow Alberta to ignore what the federal government declares is illegal? I'm not going to dive into past examples of Section 9213 in court cases because I'm not a lawyer. I don't know it that much. So this is more food for thought for you guys. I am very excited when Danielle Smith says she's going to try and make this happen, that she's going to try and fight the federal government on this. Because this doesn't just apply to firearms. Like we mentioned, this applies to vehicles, but this also applies to every single piece of private property. It doesn't matter what it is. So on to the rest of the firearms news this month. There's a lot of it. Let's start with the gun confiscation program. Now, OFA tweeted again. Now, they're a relatively FUD-like organization, so for them to tweet stuff like this, and in support of every other gun owner, is not huge, but it's not unnoticed. They called for, essentially, without saying it, the end of the confiscation program and all that, and to switch to an evidence-based policy, which we know they're not going to do. Now, if you want to, you can read some of the extra points they put in. We all know this stuff already, but if you don't, here you go. Now, will the Liberals continue on with the plans? Yes, they will. Tim Thurley tweeted this. This was from the exchange between Gary and Lawton that I mentioned earlier. The minister stated that the newly prohibited firearms, which is what they're now calling the banned guns, are not going to all be seized by October, and that an extension is under consideration. Well, that's basically guaranteed. We all knew that they had to do something because there's no chance that they get everything by October. I'd expect an extension to go to, I think they put the ones from this past March, they gave a year amnesty extension for that. I have a feeling we're going to see that go, this amnesty extension that Gary is talking about, go until that same March deadline. And then when March comes around, we're going to see it again pushed back until later in the year, or maybe even 2027. Very interestingly is they say the new revised number for the estimate is 179,000 prohibited firearms. This is laughably low. And why is this number so comically low? Well, that's because they're using extremely outdated data from 13 years ago. By using data that is 13 years old, it is creating some serious headaches for the government. Well, kind of. If we use import records, which are not the same as, registration records, obviously, but that means at some point these firearms were in Canada and the vast majority of them stayed in Canada, it's way closer to about 500,000 firearms that were banned. And again, this does not include the SKS, so that is a lot of firearms, and it also doesn't include any Canadian-made stuff. So like the WK-180s are not imported. That is a just remarkable number of guns that they are missing. Like, genuinely, they are missing the vast majority of them using this number. And what does that mean for their budgeting? Well, it means that their budgeting is completely off. So far, in the past, it's been 5 years now, plus the current budgeting for the gun ban for this upcoming year is now at $800 million, which is just pathetic, right? We're getting close to the 1 billion mark, and we're going to get to that 1 billion mark. This year, they've set aside $459 million towards the confiscation program. But again, these numbers are using the revised 179,000 firearms, not the 500,000 plus firearms that they banned. So when we combine all of this stuff with 13-year-old data and undercounting firearms and still absolutely no plans, concrete plans for getting any of this done, especially in Alberta and Saskatchewan, it's still just going to result in a complete failure of policy. We are looking closer to the $3 to $5 billion that was originally speculated, as everyone knew. Will they ever get to that point? Who knows? But it is worth noting this very next point. Now, Tim Thurley has tweeted this, and this is something that I have echoed, I think at this point, for almost a year. He said, getting it done is logistically impossible. Getting it half done is difficult. Getting it done partly, claiming it is completely done, and ending the amnesty to leave the remaining owners in lurch is not impossible. The public should be aware of that possibility. This is something that I have been saying over and over and over again, and this is what I think is going to happen. What they're going to do is they're going to, quote, launch the program, and in so launching the program, they're going to have it run for 6 months or a year or something, give the amnesty to cover that time span, and then they're just going to end it. They're going to put out notices saying, if you have these firearms, you're going to be a criminal, turn them in or else. And when the compliance rate is like 20 to 30%, they're going to end up completely and utterly humiliated. And so they're just not going to publish those results. They're going to say, all right, the program's over now, we're done, and just leave it at that. So there will be hundreds of thousands of criminals in Canada, or They shouldn't be criminals. They would be normal people made into criminals for no good reason, and it'll just stay like that until the laws change. Speaking of criminal activity, I think we need to talk about this. Now, I'm not a criminal defense lawyer, and I'm not going to comment on, the legality of all of this. This is definitely best left for Ian Runkle. This is quite literally his job. So I'm going to leave a lot of the legalities and things like that to Ian Runkle. But there was a Vaughan homeowner who was charged because he used a firearm, which I believe he shot a round or two in the air, at a group of people who were trying to steal his Lamborghini. This is, in general, actually not very good firearm self-defense advice. Like, you shouldn't be firing willy-nilly. If someone is charging you or holding a gun while looking at you, then yes, that should be valid self-defense, but shooting in the air is not necessarily that great of an idea, just in general from a self-defense standpoint. But this news story actually caught the attention of a lot of people, and that included Doug Ford. Doug Ford essentially called for castle laws. I don't know if castle laws would have actually helped in this instance, because he shot in the air, and I don't know if that would have worked, but it was very interesting to see Doug Ford, of all people, say Canada needs self-defense and castle laws. Now, there's a few things with this. Number one, if we were to reintroduce castle laws, and yes, reintroduce, we'll get to that in a second. If we were to reintroduce castle laws, well, you have to give the people the ability to acquire the tools to enact self-defense. It is currently illegal to buy pepper spray and a taser, let alone a firearm. And of course, the best thing is for Canadians to be able to buy firearms with our Canadian firearms license for self-defense. Now, this is very much not going to happen under any Liberal government, so it's not like I expect this to happen, but it is very interesting that this is a conversation that came about. And something that you might be very interested in is that Canada had castle laws. This is a article by Martin Gobin in the Toronto Sun, which I know it's the Sun, but they do have some interesting stuff occasionally. Castle laws actually date back to the British. They are not an American thing. They are technically a British thing. Englishman's home is his castle. This was actually repealed by Harper, which... that is horrible. Harper tried to change self-defense laws, and it ended up repealing the Castle Doctrine. And of course, most infamously, this had an effect on Peter Cahill, or I don't know how to say his last name. Again, watch Ian Runkle's videos on this whole saga. It is very interesting. But the Castle Doctrine was very much a Canadian thing. This was something that we had in Canada for literally over a century. But again, Canadians need the means to acquire the tools to act in self-defense, not just have the law to protect them. So that is that, but I do have a couple other interesting firearms-related news stories, one of which has to do with Argentina. Milei in Argentina has lifted Argentina's semi-automatic firearms ban, which means citizens can now buy and possess and use semi-automatic firearms with their firearms license. This is extremely significant news. And the reason I say that is that this is the biggest rollback in gun control since the fall of the USSR. And I'm not being hyperbolic. The only thing that comes close is the US sunset of the 90s assault weapons ban. In 2004, the ban was sunsetted. The difference is you could still buy semi-automatic firearms under that bill. There was a whole bunch of them. This is a complete and utter ban of semi-automatic firearms that has been undone. It is the biggest undoing of gun control that we've seen since the fall of communism. Now, hopefully, this can happen here in Canada again, because that's what it's going to take. For Canada to undo all of the gun control that the Liberals have put through in the last 5 years would be even bigger than this. Canada essentially has to do what's never been done before, but Argentina gives a little bit of hope that there is a way for it to be done. And finally, I want to end on this. The Penticton Shooting Sports Association is at risk of being shut down because the federal government is not willing to renew the lease for the land that they are on. This is a major news story, and I suggest that you write to your MPs and everything as soon as possible. I'll link to the original news story here if you want to take a look at it. And I suggest you send, especially if you're a BC resident, send your letters to the BC Firearms officer, send it to the federal government, send it to the public safety minister, send it to as many people as you can. Very interestingly, and something that I actually think might result in the range being saved, is that the BC RCMP has issued a support for the range and asked that the range is not closed. In part because the BC RCMP uses the range to train, and there's no other suitable range in the area. So I hope you guys in Penticton, if there's any of you watching, are able to get your range saved for the sake of, well, community safety and the sake of community itself. But that is it for this video. Thank you very much for watching. This has been a very, very, very long update video, but I could not have expected this many updates in one single month. There was a lot more I could have talked about, but I don't want to make this over an hour long. But thank you very much for watching. There are more firearm reviews coming soon, and I hope you enjoy them. So, that is it for this video. Have a good day.